Hey, what's going on, guys? Dr. Andrew Fix back for another episode here on the Code. Like I tell you every single time, I really appreciate your time tuning in to listen to this episode. I'm really excited to bring another awesome interview here to you guys. I'm sitting with Dr. Kyle Sela. He too is a physical therapist. He's a strength coach, and he is recording with me from his home in Idaho. And he was connected with me by a coworker, and we're going to get into a topic about Palmar cooling today. So I'm excited to talk to you guys about that. Kyle, thank you so much, man, for joining me on the Code.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invite. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just to brag a little bit on Kyle here, he's got two young kids. He's got to get off to school. We are recording this in the wee hours of the morning. The sun is not even up yet. So hopefully this conversation goes really well and you guys get something out of this episode. But Kyle, can you give us a little bit of a background on yourself? Like me, you too are a physical therapist, but where are you from? Where'd you go to school and do your training and everything like that? And how'd you get into what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I grew up in Seward, Alaska, a little small town up in Alaska. Ended up getting a bachelor's degree at Eastern Oregon University, where I tried to play a little small college hoops, and didn't last that long at the college game. But I'm a big basketball junkie. I was lucky enough to get into the Army Baylor physical therapy program, so I got my doctorate degree through Army Baylor, and so served in the Army for 7 years. After getting out of the Army and doing my time as a physical therapist on active duty, I was able enough, again, to get super lucky and fortunate to get a opportunity to work with Duke Athletic Medicine and in the Duke Sports Fellowship out there in the management of Division I athletes. At that point, my wife and I were having kids. Our second kid was on the way, and we decided to get out a little bit closer to family. My wife's from outside of Boise, Idaho, so that took us out to Boise, where I helped run the kind of sports medicine side of the house for St. Luke's, the kind of the largest health provider in Idaho. And I also got to run our sports residency program for new graduates who were interested in specializing in sports med. So ran that program for a few years, and we kept vacationing up here in Sun Valley, Idaho. And at one point we're like, man, we need to try to flip this. Let's try to live in Sun Valley and visit our family in Boise area. So 5.5 years ago, we moved up here, and I work at this incredible clinic inside of a health facility. It's a big, massive 50,000 square foot facility that has like a gym and a physical therapy clinic, pools, everything, tennis courts, everything you can think of. And just over, I guess a year and a half ago, I listened to a podcast about Palmar cooling, and that got me going down a rabbit hole. And now I'm the owner of AVA Cooling Technology.
Awesome. And, isn't it funny how, the different turns that life takes? I'm sure, because you just said you listened to it on a podcast a couple of years ago, when you were in the Army Baylor program, whatever years that was, we probably didn't even know what the heck Palmar cooling was. And now you have a business based off of that technology. So you said you moved up to Sun Valley like 5.5 years ago. Yep. Pardon my geography, I've not actually been to Idaho. Where is Sun Valley in relation to Boise? Like how far, what direction is that?
Yeah, so we're like basically due east of Boise if you flew here, but you can't fly. You got to kind of go down and around. So we're in the south central mountains of Idaho. It's a ski town. It's a beautiful ski town. We live at like 6,000 feet elevation. Super active community. The ski resort lift is 5 minutes from my house. There's no interstate near us, so it's a pretty secluded area. And we're just close to a lot of like fun outdoor things, and that's basically what we love to do as a family. So
yeah,
kind of a playground up here.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Like it. Well, and that bodes well for getting into this type of business like you have, because I've been using this charge bar, Palmar cooling bar that you sent up to me for the past several weeks, and I find it maybe unlikely that you would see this being used very much, at least right now, in a population that's not very active, that's not moving their body and pushing themselves. So it seems like it lends well to the type of area and facility that you're in. But Now, in addition to being a physical therapist, you do some strength coaching too. Is that right?
Yeah. So, kind of towards the end of my Army career, I was stationed in Savannah, Georgia, and we had a big Army Ranger contingent on post with me. And I was the only physical therapist on post. And so I would start taking care of those guys. And they were kind of on basically like a professional sports schedule. So they would deploy for 4 months, come home for 7 months, redeploy. Some of the guys had 15, 16 deployments, shorter ones than like a normal Army person, but basically like a professional season. And I started working with their strength coaches and just started getting really involved. And, I've always been into fitness, but really looking at like the sports performance side of the house from a tactical athlete standpoint. So that got me really interested. And then when I went to the Duke Sports Medicine Fellowship, I was working out of the athletic training rooms with, a multidisciplinary team, but a big part of that team was the performance coaches, especially when I started with Duke football. And I found myself gravitating towards the strength room and really picking their brains more than anything during my fellowship. I just felt like, that's where us as physical therapists, maybe our schooling falls a little bit short of being able to take someone from a post-op situation, making them safe enough, but then, blending that into a performance realm. And I guess that's just where I find my sweet spot is like being able to, I always say like my goal is like for my athlete to get done with physical therapy when they show up to their strength coach. They don't have to be taught movement patterns. They don't have to be taught, about intensities, work rest ratios, all that stuff that they're ready to go. They're ready to like jump into that strength training program. So that's always been a goal of mine is like, I want that athlete to look like, they're not coming from a physical therapist who's been doing, external rotation on their side, but they've actually been like doing some lifts. So at this point in my I work for a certain number of hours for my employer right now as a physical therapist, but that's probably 50% personal training / strength coach. And then 50%, clinical, billing insurance, typical physical therapy work.
Got it. Yeah. And, it's funny because my colleague, Nate Henry is who introduced us, and I just had him on the podcast. His episode's not live yet as the recording of this, but he was talking about his time in physical therapy program and his early career, his early positions and whatnot. And he said a very similar thing to what you just said, that I think, one of the ways that as a general rule, the field of physical therapy often falls short is our ability to continue to progress exercise and performance prescription. And I would agree too. What I remember saying to him when we were recording that was, what I think physical therapists are the best at is regressing things and being able to find things for people to do despite the fact that they have issues bothering them, and we can work through and work around those things. But then there becomes this point where a lot of times we struggle to work past it as a profession. And, there still seems to be this chasm between where physical therapy ends and where performance begins in a lot of places, a lot of cities, a lot of facilities. So I totally would echo what you just said. You said you were in the Army for 7 years, right? Thank you so much for your service. I know myself and all the people listening to this really appreciate that. So thank you for that. Do you remember, Kyle, the podcast that you listened to that got you introduced to Palmar cooling in the first place?
Yeah, so this took me down a 1.5 year now rabbit hole. So I was actually it was in the middle of summer. It was July, I think it was mid-July. There's again our ski mountains there, and you're allowed to like hike up and then take the lifts down. So that kind of saves your that eccentric look on the way down. Totally. So it's a great workout. So I tend to like use a weighted vest when I'm really trying to torture myself. And so I'm going up and I'm actually listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman, but not on his podcast. He was actually talking to Joe Rogan on the podcast. And Huberman is all about human performance in a lot of different realms, but he starts talking about, temperature regulation for one. And as a sports trained physical therapist, temperature is taught in our sports medicine curriculum, but it's all about preventing, that getting to that 104 degrees and having, a heat stroke. That's basically
shutdown.
That basically is like, okay, let's be aware that we can have heat stroke or heat exhaustion, and let's not get people. But he's talking about it in terms of like, what the impact is from a human performance standpoint is. And then he starts talking about Dr. Heller's research out of Stanford. So it's not actually Huberman's research, it's Dr. Heller's, about using the palms of the hands to cool the body and how effective and efficient that is, and the why behind it. And so that got me really intrigued because, you know, I was 13 years into my professional career at that point. I'm a pretty big nerd about human physiology and anatomy and training. And I honestly had never heard of it. And I was like, what is going on? And the numbers that he was talking about as far as improvement goes, I was like, this kind of sounds like BS. I don't know if this is true, but I got to try this. And again, I'm like, it's in the middle of summer, I'm dying of heat. So the whole podcast is really resonating with me. Like, you know, if I could do something to control my heat right now, I know I'd be able to go up this mountain faster at least. And so I came home and started kind of looking around.
Yeah, and it's funny. I had a feeling you were going to say that. I didn't know, which episode, but I have had the opportunity to reference Andrew Huberman's podcast a couple different times on episodes that I do. And, one of the things that I remember talking about, I did an episode several months back on the benefits of cold exposure and exposing your body to cold, right? To ice baths and whatnot. And one of the things I remember talking about, I remember hearing this on his episode on cold exposure, was the palms, the feet, and portions of your face where this glabrous skin tissue is because of where this heat transfer and temperature regulation takes place. Having your hands or your face, because of course your feet are typically in the ice bath already, but having your hands in there, dunking your head in there, it makes it so much harder because your body is spilling more and more and more of the heat by exchanging it with that cold water. Yes. And I've experienced that totally myself. I could sit in an ice bath for several minutes if my hands are not in there. But if your hands are in there, it cuts that time down for sure, because it just makes it a little bit harder. Totally. I know you have this on your website for AVA Cooling Technology, and we'll definitely link that in the show notes. But what I would love for you to do is, if you would be able to sort of summarize what some of that research is for us from Dr. Heller and that you have on your page, like Palmar cooling, as you just explained it, is holding something cool in the palms of your hands to decrease your body temperature, right?
Yeah.
Spill some of the heat from your body and dissipate some of that because it may produce some performance benefits. Yeah. But go into that a little bit and explain how that works for us. So
I think let's start off with, kind of the why behind this. Why do we fatigue, right? So I think that's always a good question to start with. There's nutrition aspects, there's recovery aspects as far as sleep and all that stuff goes. But I think something that I underestimated, or maybe had never really considered well enough, was as we exercise, there's byproducts of exercise. And one of those byproducts of exercise is that our body temperature will rise. And a rise in body temperature can become deadly, again, if we get up to that 104-degree range. But until that point, it's also going to begin to cause fatigue in our body. And it's postulated that, there's probably two primary ways that increasing body heat creates fatigue, right? And so there's one, a muscle cellular level fatigue. So what happens as our working muscle cells increase in temperature, there seems to be a change in the configuration of some enzymes in the muscle cell. And by changing the configuration, the muscle cell is less able to continue doing its job as an efficient rate. So our muscle cell, excuse me, sorry, my alarm is going off for some reason.
That's all right.
Sorry about that. Okay, so at the muscle cell level, that rise in body temperature changes some enzyme configuration, renders the muscle cell less able to continue doing its job. So that's one way heat can cause fatigue. I think that's kind of an easy concept to think of. And then there seems to be a more mental aspect of it. So our body temperature is primarily controlled at the hypothalamus. That's kind of the thermostat of our body. And that it's kind of taking in signals as we exercise or whatever the environment is, and makes fluctuations, right? So we might start sweating, we might vasodilate in the periphery, we may start moving, it may tell us to stop moving. So whatever it is from a hot or cold situation, that's happening at the hypothalamus. So Dr. Heller says, okay, well, if increasing body, so as we increase at the brain level, increasing body temperature seems to decrease our motivation to want to continue training at that same level. And so, and this might be like an evolutionary type thing that we evolved with, where, you know, if we're out, you know, as hunter gatherers trying to hunt in hot weather, this may tell us to, like, you know, hey, our body's just doing calculations the whole time. Like, how much longer can we go at this level with this amount of food, with this type of heat, before we have to shut it down? So again, so going back to increasing body temperature from exercise, you know, has a muscle cell level cause of fatigue, and then also a mental motivational level of fatigue.
Sure.
Okay. So there's like that central control, but then Dr. Heller describes that glabrous skin is another area that we're in the periphery. We can really effectively manage body temperature through what you said earlier, glabrous skin. And glabrous skin is the hairless portions, like on our palms, on the hairless portions of our face and the soles of our feet. And it's not so much the glabrous skin, but what's going on underneath that glabrous skin is this specialized network of blood vessels called arterial venous anastomosis. And our product's called AVA, but it's really AVA, so arterial venous anastomosis. And this is where your artery comes down, right, and brings blood out, and then it directly connects to a vein to create a circuit. And this is specialized in that in other parts of the body, or most of the body, there's going to be a capillary bed involved there. And so as the artery comes down, blood goes into capillaries. That's where we let go of oxygen, grab CO2 and other metabolites, and we're kind of doing that exchange. In an AVA, it's just a direct circuit. So underneath the glabrous skin of our palms, face, and soles, we have this kind of circuit that is mainly used for temperature regulation. And what, you know, in the podcast, what really resonated with me, and what I tell people is, you know, if you're hot at night, what's the first thing you do is you stick your foot out from underneath the covers to dump heat, right? Or if you were cold and you walked up to a fire, you immediately kind of stick the palms of your hand out towards the fire. Or this morning, it's cold in my house, and so I have my hand around my warm mug of coffee, because we can effectively accept heat or dump heat through those areas really efficiently. So Dr. Heller says, okay, if exercise causes an increase in body temperature, increasing body temperature causes fatigue in a couple primary ways. And we've got these zones of our body that are highly effective and efficient at managing temperature. Like, what happens when we use that on purpose to allow our body to more effectively dump heat, like between sets or between intervals or during a timeout of the game? And his early research, I think, you know, he talks about this classic body weight dip study that I think he invited a couple 49ers players down because they were at Stanford. So they come down and on day one, they're going to do, you know, kind of max reps, body weight dips with a 3-minute rest interval in between. And on day one, they do it with, during that rest break, they don't do anything special. They just have the athlete rest. Let's say that athlete got 100 reps over 7 sets. 5 days later, they bring the athlete back in, repeat the same study. And during that 3-minute rest interval, they have them using their device. They have the athlete Palmar cool during that 3-minute rest break.
Yeah.
And Dr. Heller didn't put a cap on how many sets you could do. You just you tap out when you want to tap out, you know, you go to failure each set. And so in that second one, not only did the athlete get more reps per set, but the athlete didn't get that negative feedback loop to just stop training. He just kept going on and doing more and more sets. And I believe what they published was like a 60% improvement in reps completed in that second workout, which is
smokes.
Yeah, when I heard that on Dr. Rogan, or on Joe Rogan's podcast with Dr. Huberman, that's what got me. 60% is for, you know, and this is an NFL athlete, so this isn't someone who was out of shape on day one, or brand new to the exercise. So I was 60% is crazy. And so that kind of speaks back to the 2 levels of fatigue, though. There's that, hey, more reps per set, your muscles aren't fatiguing as quick during that next set, but then also that mental, hey, you're not getting that signal to, hey, we better shut it down here. Let's stop working as hard. And so he was able to do more sets as well.
Yeah, it's amazing the effect, right, that the mind has over the body. So whether it's because, you know, it's hot, your body's getting hot, and there's a brain kind of motivational shutdown aspect where your brain is sort of subconsciously telling you, hey, we better back it off here, because, you know, we didn't evolve to exercise in a gym. We evolved to, like you said, hunt and do things in nature. So But that also kind of reminds me of that mental and motivational aspect. Kind of reminds me of, I just read a study recently, or I didn't read the whole study, but I saw the summary essentially of a study that basically mentioned, if you strength train and you're strength training trying to hit like high percentages of your max, and you're trying to really lift heavy, that doing that after a lot of very mentally taxing activities such as work or schoolwork or whatnot, you have a lesser ability to hit your high percentages.
That's interesting,
because you've used up a lot of brain power and mental energy doing those highly demanding tasks. And then that may have a negative impact on your workouts. So one of the potential conclusions they came to was, depending on what kind of mental tasks you have to do in your day, if you want to strength train very heavy, potentially do that in the earlier portion of the day, maybe not the first hour you wake up, but like earlier in the day before you sort of fatigue your mind, or do it on a day, later in the day where your day is not quite as mentally demanding.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just think that's an interesting study. I'd love to check that out.
Oh yeah. I want to find it. But speaking of the studies you mentioned, I'll try to put those and find those and put those in the show notes. But that's 60%. That's an amazing number. Now you have done some kind of experiments with yourself and with other people, right? Where you are doing Palmar cooling or not during the sets. What are some of the things that you've found in some of the experiments that you've run?
Yeah. So, so after listening to that podcast and hearing that 60% number, they got me very intrigued. Right. So I got home, tried to find something to purchase online, do this. And, the Stanford group had been developing this thing called the Cool Mitt and they developed it years ago. And basically what it is, it's like this mitt system you put on. It's pretty elaborate. It's got like a tube that runs through the mitt that's funneling cold water through it. It's connected to, like, as a physios on here would know, like a cryo cuff type cooler. With those hoses connected to your mitt, right? And so it's circulating cool water through there. So at the time that I heard this, it wasn't even available yet. You were on a waiting list, and I believe it's like $1,200 to $1,500 for one mitt. I was like, well, this is out of my price range, and I don't want to wait 9 months or whatever it was until this comes out. I want to try this now. So that got me going down the rabbit hole of like kind of developing a prototype or just coming up with something to use. And so I ended up coming up with my first prototype. I'm not an engineer, obviously. So I actually like joined a bunch of Facebook engineering groups and started talking to nerds on there about like what types of materials would be best and why. And so anyway, I get my first prototype and I'm like, okay, let's see what happens here. And so the first test I wanted to do was because I didn't really hold that athlete doing that first test to like the same sets. I wanted to know, like, hey, if I'm only allowed to do 7 sets on both days, like how much more work would I get done, right? Yeah. And so I chose, and I also wanted to do the same for my first big test. I wanted to do the same work interval. So I did 7 sets to failure of a seated shoulder press. And I chose that so as I fatigued, I wouldn't start using my hips and legs to get a little boost. I just wanted to see what my shoulders and arms were capable of. And I can really tell when I lock out. So it's just an easy one to like hold yourself to a standard and not cheat accidentally. And so I did that test on day 1. It was a Sunday morning around 10. I was like, okay, I'm gonna do the same breakfast. I'm gonna do the same. I didn't have breakfast. I had like a banana and a coffee, which is like a normal thing for me before my workout. I do a lot of shoulder pressing, so it's something I'm already good at. So, or decent at, right? But something I'm accustomed to, I should say. Yeah. And so I did my 7 sets to failure, and I think I got like 128 reps or something over 7 sets. So I wanted it to be kind of high volume too. So my first set, I think I had like 28 reps or something. So it's kind of a moderately lightweight, but I knew I would have like a pretty steep like fatigue curve by going to failure, right? And so then I repeated it. I also want to know, like, okay, like I'm going to repeat this the very next day when I probably should do worse if I'm doing the same exact workout.
You would think so.
So and you can debate that, but that was my idea. Is like, okay, let's see how I am in a fatigue day. Let's see what the difference is really going to be. And so woke up, did the exact same kind of routine. And then I used my device for the Palmar cooling during the 3 minutes, and I got like 150 something reps. So it was actually, I think it calculated out to like I think it was an 18% bump in performance, which, as a strength coach or physical or anybody, like that's a pretty, pretty awesome improvement on that very next day. And honestly, when I woke up that day too, I mean, I was kind of sore from the workout before. I don't train to failure 7 times very often, so my motivation to even do that workout was a little bit low. So I was just really happy with the results there, and it got me thinking, like, man, there's something here, and I could kind of feel it. I could feel it when I would start that next set. I'm like, I feel more recovered than when I was just kind of sitting there. But also 3 minutes of just sitting there and resting is also kind of different than how I normally train. I would typically, put in a circuit. Either I'm doing like 2 exercises that are like a superset, or I might create like 3 exercises that don't negatively affect each other. So I felt like, and then I also felt like, this is supposed to help me regulate temperature, but by the end of 3 minutes, I felt pretty recovered just normally anyway on day 1. I just felt like, okay, that whole recovery process, at least for me, was pretty efficient at a 3 rest interval. So my next test, I did like a seated row, like a cable row. And I chose that because my knuckles could hit my ribs. I knew I was pulling it through a full range of motion. And so I could tell like when that was going to happen. And I also threw in, like, after I finished my set to failure, I threw in like a jumping lunge exercise to jack my heart rate up, just to get some temperature going. And then I only did a 60-second rest break on that. So I wanted to see what the effect would be with a little bit shorter natural recovery, and also a little bit shorter Palmar cooling. And on that workout, it was set up a little bit differently, but the comparison was a 30%, like a 28% bump in reps to failure. So that was significant. So now I've got like 2 tests with my prototype giving me like, and I'm, and this, I don't even have a business at this point. This is just me being, a nerd and trying to figure out if this stuff works. Me seeing if this is like an effective tool. And also at the same time, like I said, I'm a physical therapist, but I also train clients. Probably 50% of my clinic time is actually training people in a room. And I'm using it with them. And what I'm noticing is that they really gravitate towards it. People love picking it up between their sets. If I leave it on the floor and I'm just talking to them, they step over and grab it off the floor if I didn't hand it to them. Further down the line, people were starting to like get kind of annoyed with me if I don't bring it to the training session. So it was just something like, man, there's just something kind of like, sticking your foot out from underneath the blanket. There's just something inherently here that we like to use this system, and we do use the system already. And they're definitely feeling an enhanced recovery going into that next set. And I'm noticing that they're training a little bit harder than they had been when we deploy that.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And like you said, any physical therapist, any coach, I'll take an 18% improvement any day of the week, right? 18% is massive. What is something that we wouldn't want to be 18% better? I can't come up with an answer. So now, and I remember reading kind of both of those, little experiments you did for yourself on the website. And I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna test them out and see what it shows, so I can give you that feedback. But how I've been using the anti-fatigue charge bar so far is kind of like you just said with some of your clients that you're working with in the facility, is I've been holding it between sets of exercises. What I have been doing is not necessarily holding it from the very beginning of the workout, like during say I'm doing squats or something. I'm not necessarily holding it during my like warm-up sets, but I'm holding it during my working sets. Like if I'm doing 5 sets of squats, I probably start holding it after my first or second set of 5. And but where I am noticing, I think the bigger difference for me is less in my ability to do more weight, but more in my ability to do more sets, right? More reps. Because and that's what makes more sense to me too. As you're describing these little tests that you have run, it sort of makes more sense that it might produce a bigger effect during the shorter rest break times. Like when you did the 1 minute compared to the 3, because when your body is having less time to dissipate this heat, anything that you could do to potentially help it out, could only be maybe beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think that's a big thing to consider here, like from a physics standpoint, right? We don't accept cold, we dump heat. And that's what, like my device is like, it's stupid simple. It's simple, but it's designed for certain ways. So we need to like leverage our ability to dump heat onto something and create that temperature gradient. We don't necessarily need like circulating cold water, because that's kind of redundant. Like our body's like pushing blood through the palm, and that's already circulating. And as that blood circulates through, it releases its heat, right? That's why how this system works. So that's why a super simple tool like this can be effective. And yeah, I mean, I think, and seeing like the bigger improvement in the shorter work interval also got me really excited about sports, because most sports, if there's timeouts or breaks between play, like I said, I'm a basketball junkie. Like basketball just lines up perfectly for this, because there's short breaks throughout the game. There's timeouts. There's times when an athlete can do that. And then back to what you said about this is not going to help you lift more weight, more like higher amounts of weight in your training session, but this is going to allow you to maybe increase your work volume in a training session and then over a training cycle, right? Yeah. So there's been a couple studies looking at like bench press and a couple others, I think, looking at like what happens over a training cycle of using Palmar cooling compared to not, and people end up with a higher 1 rep max or a calculated 1 rep max, because they've increased their training volume over time. And so I think that's the big thing here. And I've been working with some NBA teams, and there's Klaus Souza from the Denver Nuggets near you. He started playing around with this, and he's 43, big, strong guy, like super fit. So he started using this back in September, I think, or October of 2022. He's like, and he's sending me his heart rate data and everything all the time. And he's like, this is crazy, man. He's like, I've gotten my heaviest back squat and my heaviest deadlift after my training cycle with this. So he PR'd at age 43.
That's awesome. Yeah.
He's like, honestly, he has no skin in the game or anything. He's like, the only thing I'm doing differently this year is Palmar cooling between my sets. And he's just getting more work volume in. And, he's got a very regimented lifestyle and workout program. So we are seeing those gains happen, but this just allows you to work harder for longer in your workout, and then extrapolate that over a training cycle, and you're going to see incredible benefits.
Yeah. And that's kind of my motivation for using it too. I have some strength goals, trying to see. I'm 32 now, I'll be 33 later this year. And I'm trying to see if I can get back to some of my old college football weightlifting PRs, and honestly, not that far off. So, squatting is actually the only one that I have not surpassed yet. So we're getting back to that. Yeah, we did a lot of squats in college football. So, but back to like what you were saying, the device that you have is pretty simple, right? It's a metal bar, it's a metal tube with 2 rubber kind of caps on each end. And the one that you sent me, from what I understand, this isn't how it was initially, but it has you have a thermometer stuck through there, which is so cool because you can see what the temperature of the liquid inside, of the water inside is. But how did you come upon like settling on, at least for the time being, that that piece of equipment?
Yeah. So going back to coming home from that hike and trying to find something to buy there, I didn't find anything. And so I knew I wanted to have something that could fit both hands. I wanted to be able to cool both hands at once to maximize surface area. I knew I wanted to be able to kind of like recool it whenever I needed to, like in the gym at a water fountain or whatever. I didn't even know a water fountain at that time, but I knew the 2 hands at once was big to me, and I wanted it to be affordable, obviously. And so I got onto those Facebook groups and I started talking to engineers about like, hey, what am I looking for? I knew the concept. I was like, I want to be able to dump heat onto this thing, but not have it change its temperature very much. And they're like, oh, Kyle, if you don't remember, in physics, there's a thing called specific heat. There's a thing called specific heat capacity, and that's a measure of how much energy a material can take before it changes its own temperature, like 1 degree Celsius. So they're like, so find something with a high specific heat capacity and use that. And so, and then, another guy was like, but you also want it to be highly conductive, right? So high specific heat capacity, but also highly conductive. So materials that conductive just means that it won't just heat up right under your palm, right? But it will displace that heat along the whole surface area of that material. So, so plastic has a really high specific heat capacity, but it's not conductive at all. So you will just like directly heat you'll heat up that plastic under your palm, and that heat won't get dispersed along the rest of the material.
Absolutely.
So, yep. So when I started looking at different materials, the metal, there's a couple metals out there that are safe to handle that also have a high specific heat capacity. So the aluminum that I chose and the thickness of it, I played around with some different not shapes, but different thicknesses and all that to come up with our device. But aluminum has a very high specific heat capacity, and it's highly conductive. So it was perfect. And then another engineer was like, hey, and you want to fill that thing with water. So that volume inside of it, if you fill that with water has one of the highest specific heat capacities of anything on Earth. And that water will also buffer a bunch of heat that you dump into it. And so, so basically the way it works is like your body dumps heat into the aluminum dumps heat into the water. And that allows it to stay as cool as possible, for as long as possible, even though you're dumping heat into it compared to some other materials that you might pick.
And having that water inside of it, right, makes that way more effective than if you were just holding a cool metal bar that was hollow on the inside. Keeps it cool so much longer.
Yeah. And if you think about it, okay, like I can even just swish that water around, that kind of recools the edges of the bar. And so that was it. Yeah. So it's just, it's just something you can clean really easy. I ended up getting the caps that I want. And yeah, so it's just it's a simple, super effective tool that, after a while it heats up because you're dumping heat into it. But if you have a water source, so lucky enough for me, so we haven't talked about this yet, but we want this thing cool, not cold. Right. And so,
and I definitely want you to mention this. Absolutely.
Yeah. So, because I hear a lot of people like, oh, I'm just going to grab, a bag of ice, or I'm going to have frozen peas on my hand. I'm like, and again, more research needs to be done on all of this, but the idea here is that you don't want your nervous system to respond as if it is really cold out, or you have your hand on ice, because what happens if you do that, you will vasoconstrict. So those blood vessels will shrink down and respond as if it is freezing cold if you have it on freezing cold environment. And then you won't be circulating that blood through there. So the effective range that I found is probably 45 to 60 degrees. Dr. Heller said 50 to 60 is a sweet spot, but I found that most people actually are responding really well around 45. And I think you can actually get a little bit of accustomed to this too. Our sink at work is set at 42 degrees. And that doesn't feel too cold to me. So, my easiest way to explain this to people when they're finding their starting temperature is find something that doesn't feel uncomfortably cold. If it feels uncomfortable, put your hands on it, you're probably going to vasoconstrict because you're perceiving it as too cold. So your nervous system probably is as well. And then for our device, if you fill it to if you get it set to 45 degrees, whether that's the water temperature or you take your water and you put it in a fridge and that's your starting point, you're going to get you're probably going to get close to an hour before you get above that 60 degree mark if you're using it intermittently throughout your workout. So that's a really huge factor, I think, is that it's not, it doesn't feel uncomfortably cold, and that we're not using we're not using frozen things here to induce Palmar cooling.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point, because I've been noticing very similar thing. Like I told you, I've been keeping the charge bar in the refrigerator at the clinic or gym that I do most of my training in. And what I've been doing is taking it out, and I don't exactly know what the temperature is it's like one of those little mini fridges, right? So it's not necessarily telling you the temperature. It's what level of coldness do you want this at? But it's been coming out of the refrigerator somewhere in the 37 degree range. And if I grab it at that time, it feels too cold to be comfortable to hold in between sets. Especially if you're wanting to maybe hold it for a minute or whatever, it's a little uncomfortable to hold that for 60 seconds when it's 37 degrees. So I've been taking it out, letting it kind of warm up to closer to that 45 degrees. And what I actually did yesterday, because I forgot to grab it before, when I was doing my warm up. And then I was like you said, some of your athletes are like, why didn't you bring this to the gym? I was like, oh shoot, I left it in the refrigerator. So I went and grabbed it, But what I was doing was I was kind of wrapping my t-shirt around it and holding it through the t-shirt.
Yeah.
And it was much warmer by doing that instead of just holding it straight on the skin on the metal. But yeah, it definitely seems like that slightly warmer, cool temperature, not freezing cold temperature, works a little bit better.
Yeah.
And, from like a science standpoint, right, it makes sense. You don't want the vasoconstriction to happen because that's not going to help you get blood flow to the tissues that you need to do work. And you just need the temperature to be cooler than the blood flow that is circulating through those AVA sections.
Exactly. Yeah. And that even, I think there's some research showing like that top end range of like 60 degrees, which if you started at 42, 60 doesn't feel very cold anymore. But if you walked up and grabbed something that was 60 degrees and you didn't have that kind of like pre-cooling already, you'd be like, yeah, that's pretty cool. And showing like really good results at 60. And so I tell people like, they're like, oh, it's getting too warm too fast. I'm like 60 degrees feels warm, but it's still, you're still having, and you think your body's, at minimum 97, 98 degrees. And if you're working out, it's probably a little higher than that. That's a huge, that's a nice big temperature gradient to really create that thermal dump. So, and that again, going back to this really simple tool, no, there's no internal like cooling system. There's nothing, because if we did all that, it turns into the Stanford unit. That's just not super practical, right? The Cool Mitt is big and clunky, and people, what people heard, like the big argument you hear is like, okay, this research came out in like 2010, and if it works, why isn't everyone doing it already? And honestly, I think people were just kind of overthinking how to do this, and we had this like really fancy tool that just seemed like, for the lay person, or for the person, for like us who just kind of normal people like who like to train and work out, like that's just not a realistic thing. And then if you look at it, it's just, even if I could afford it, I'm not going to carry that thing around the gym and have two of them just for each hand. And like on the sidelines of an NBA or college game, they're not going to do that. It just changes the normal flow too much. But the science is there, and other universities have kind of backed it up that like, hey, yeah, there's definitely an effect here if you can find a way to deploy it. So.
Yeah. I think it's awesome. And, just like anything, if you can find a more practical or simple way to apply it, right? That's a lot of times where the rubber meets the road, right? Is if we have information that makes sense and, things work. Well, the hard part is finding a way to apply it and implement it, right? And if you can't implement it, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. So having something like this that's easy to implement, it doesn't take a lot of effort to put this into your rest breaks or anything like that. And one thing that I've kind of noticed too is, I think the science makes great sense to me. Like in my head, I'm like, and anytime I have something that like I understand it, I'm like, that makes sense. I'm like, how can I then start doing this? Which is, why I started doing ice baths and I spend time in the sauna and whatnot. Is it fun to hop in there? No, it's not that fun. But I know that there's science to back it up. So I'm like, well, I'm going to do this. But the other thing that I notice when I am in between my sets, I finish my set, like I was doing a circuit yesterday, and I train in a similar fashion to you, it sounds like, where a lot of times what we do in this gym is we'll have a warm up, we'll have a strength component where it is more of like that. You lift, you take a rest break, you lift, you take a rest break during your sets of squats. But then the rest of the workout is more in a circuit format, metabolic conditioning, where for the most part, the successive exercises aren't affecting negatively the other ones before it too much. And then, it's like, okay, you do 4 rounds in a 15-minute time interval or something. And what I was doing yesterday was I was finishing my 4 exercises, and then I was holding the bar for like 45 to 60 seconds. And then I did that each time I went through. And there's becoming to me like something slightly ritualistic about it. Like, okay, I'm grabbing it because it's cool. But what I'm noticing I'm also doing while I'm holding that is I'm paying more attention to my breath. I'm paying attention to trying to slow down my breath and, breathe through my nose and just like try to let my body recover. And I know that was something that I always did a lot of during, I used to run a track in high school and collegiately. And, the more that you can recover during those short intervals during your workouts, the more you can slow your breathing down, slow your heart rate down, the more intervals of work you're able to do, right? Before you get too fatigued. So that's what I'm also noticing is I'm just more aware of trying to let my body recover during those recovery periods.
Yeah, and I would say like there might be I don't know if you track your heart rate during this, but what and there's some research to show this now too, is that dumping of heat allows our heart rate to recover a little bit quicker. So getting back to your baseline or target heart rate that you want to call your recovery heart rate is happening at a steeper slope than if you're not Palmar cooling. So that dumping of the heat takes a little bit of the stress off the body. So, and I try to do nasal breathing too, especially during my recovery. But if your heart rate is jacked up, it's really hard to do that, or your respiration rate's up. It's really hard to push that air in and out of your nose. But if our heart rate has started to come down faster, that might allow it. But I agree, as I train clients, a lot of times there's pressure as a trainer to keep them busy. And really, I really want them to pay attention to hey, we worked really hard. I need you to rest for this long, right? We're actually going to do twice as much rest as work today. And so I really try to be good about this. And honestly, as a personal, when I'm doing my personal training, this really allows me to for them, they're oh, okay, they have this thing that they're doing actively. This is the active recovery as I dump heat. And so I really want to take advantage of that. So it allows people to kind of chill out and just be okay with not having every second of that hour with me filled with something. I'm hey, our next set's going to be way better if we dump heat and we actually take this rest period. So I would say that I feel very similarly that it's actually a ritual in that, we just get more intentional about what we're doing between those efforts.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely what I'm noticing. And, especially if, your goals are, strength related, right? I think the rest breaks, like you talked about, I think that's one of the reasons, or one of maybe I don't know if I want to say downfalls, because there's a lot of successful pieces about group fitness, exercise classes type of things. But those classes are not typically designed to get people strong, right?
Yeah.
To build a lot of strength, because they're usually done in a more circuit kind of ongoing format, and there's much less rest breaks than there is work time. Well, you need rest breaks in order to actually get strong and powerful and do things to your highest percentage capacity. So no, I think it makes great sense. I think I really appreciate you hopping on here and talking about this. What I would love for you to do, since I know you got to get your kiddos to school, but I want people to be able to check this out, right? So where can, Kyle, people find you guys? What's the website? What's the social media? Where can people find this so they can try it out for themselves?
Yeah, so our device is, we sell it on our online store. It's avacooling.com. So AVA Cooling.com. And I have links to some of this research that we're discussing and some other research. And you can buy an individual unit. We have team packs for teams that are interested in this. And then on social media, Instagram, TikTok, it's AVA Cooling Technology, all written out. So AVA Cooling Technology at whatever that social media is, and you'll find us. And we're pretty active on there, posting about the different teams and athletes that are using it, but also when people tell us different unique ways that they might be using it. We've got people who are dealing with post-COVID long haul symptoms, and their heart rate gets too out of control during exercise, so it's allowing them. We've got firefighters using it when they go off, when they come off the line and they've used too much oxygen, and they're forced to take a rest break before going back on the fire. They're using it to get their biometrics back under control. So we're seeing a lot of different people from a lot of different avenues. I mean, right off the bat in your podcast today, you mentioned that this might be more something for people who are really fit and kind of nerding out about it. But there's actually an awesome study by Dr. Stacy Sims when she was at Stanford. She took a group of 24 sedentary obese females who were just getting into fitness. And I won't get into the weeds of it. For basically, the group that deployed Palmar cooling, had lowered their BMI. They did more work. They had higher. So basically, every outcome measure improved more in the Palmar cooling group. So this is allowing people to tolerate exercise more, which makes sense. And that's on any of the spectrum. So if you're just starting, and temperature, you're overweight, and temperature might affect you even more, right? To the elite athlete who needs that last few percentage points of improvement to go from a silver to a bronze medal to a gold medal. So you can see it across the board. body temperature and regulation of it is something that we all need to consider as humans and athletes. It's not for the elite. It's for everybody, because we're all dealing with this. It's just a byproduct of exercise. And it's, I don't want to go too long here, but like, back when I was in high school, I'm 44. So in high school in the 90s, people were still like, you had to be rewarded with a hydration break during practice, right? So like I didn't have a water bottle. Like every once in a while, the coach would be like, okay, you guys can get a drink of water now. And now people will be like, that's kind of crazy. Like we should hydrate as we need to, right? I think in 20 years, this is where temperature regulation is going to be like, people are going to be like, of course we temperature regulate. Like, why would you not do that? It's such a huge component of fatigue. Like, cool yourself off, like find a way to dump heat. So I think that's where we're going. And one last thing I wanted to mention, because we're getting a lot of attention from the teams that are working with us. You mentioned earlier, Andrew, too, about like the best time to work out. So if we talk to sleep scientists, they're going to tell you that working out in the morning is probably the best time to exercise from a sleep standpoint, because your body has the rest of the day to kind of get back to homeostasis. And a big part of that is how long it takes our body temperature to go back down after exertion. Right. Well, most of our athletes and many adults, like if they even like adult leagues, but even like the NBA, NCAA athletes, a lot of them are practicing and more importantly, like performing or competing at night, which is probably the worst time from a sleep standpoint to then try to go home and like, hell, you just like played a basketball game in front of 20,000 people. Like now try to go to sleep right on time. And so not only like hormonally are they elevated, but temperature they're elevated. And so we've created a sleep protocol where these people, when you get home, like you immediately start rolling, because you're going to be like eating and you're going to be, texting and playing video games or whatever with your hands. Start rolling that bar on the palmar, on the glabrous skin of your feet, right? And get a good dose of like cooling on your feet. And then when you get into bed, hold the bar for a little bit longer. And we're hearing like awesome results. Like some of our teams are kind of assigning these to the athlete to take home who struggles with temperature or struggles with just falling asleep. And so I think that's another way that we can deploy this physiology, or at least educate people. I'm like, hey, don't cover your head, get your hands out, stick your feet out. Like there's a reason we do this, but maybe even enhance it more with like a cooling device. So I just want to make sure that that's something people kind of look into. And we need research on this stuff. This is like, just in general, this whole idea is under researched right now. And we need to like these parameters of like what's the best ratio? Like we're finding 60 to 90 seconds creates a bigger difference between groups than a 3-minute, right? For the reasons that we talked to, but I think there's a lot of parameters that we need to like really hash out here. But right now, I mean, we're just, I'm having a blast doing this, and like, we're just getting like people from all walks of life and all different types of sports and activities who are reporting improvement.
I think that's awesome. And, that sleep stuff that you just talked about, I mean, it makes great sense to me because if our body temperature is too high, we struggle to sleep, we struggle to get rest. So anything you could do to kind of calm or cool that down, that can only kind of be beneficial. I think that's a brilliant idea to try that. There was one thing that came to mind. I don't know why, when you were describing this about like, okay, I was on this hike, I wanted to come home and figure out some way to do this. I don't know why I was just picturing you like running your hands under cold water in between sets of push-ups or something, like, oh, how am I going to cool my hands down? Let me just stick them under the sink here. And before you found something to actually use to hold on to do this. And, when you guys go check out the, the website and look at these things, what it reminded me of was like an oversized version of like a baton that I used to hold in track and field, right? It's a, little metal it was plastic or metal in track, but it's like a larger around, which it was a little bit bigger than I expected it to be when it arrived in the mail, when you sent it, but makes sense because, I'm 5'9". I'm not like a 7-foot NBA player. And for someone like that to have both hands on it at the same time, that probably has larger hands than I do, it needs to be decent size. So you can get both hands on it at the same time and have it touch the entire surface of your hand. So it's like an oversized track baton with rubber caps on each end, very simple and easy to tote around. Doesn't take a lot of space up in your gym bag or anything like that. So
exactly. Yeah. It's just, again, the more surface area, the longer it's going to take to heat up, the more volume inside, the longer it's going to take to heat up. So I think we just kind of, and then, I do have a couple like 7'2" guys. I think they're like, hey, this could be a little bit bigger, but like I'm just like,
they're the outliers. Yeah.
Yeah, most of us, like, this is actually, and even most basketball players are finding it. It's just it's fine. But yeah, I think
That's
it
funny.
kind of like, it's kind of the sweet spot of like maximizing, how much energy you can put into it, but not being so big that it's like too cumbersome to carry around.
Yeah, totally. Well, again, Kyle, thank you so much for hopping on here. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day, but really appreciate your time talking about AVA Cooling Technology and Palmar Cooling. And again, for all of you guys that tuned in to listen to this episode, thank you so much. If you have listened to other episodes, you've heard me say this before, we are trying to get this podcast out to more and more people. So please hop on to whatever podcast platform you're at, whether it's up at the top or the bottom, drop us a review on there. We're trying to get up to 200 5-star reviews on this podcast so we can get it in front of more eyes and ears. So thank you so much for that. And Kyle, thanks again, man. Have an awesome day.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, man. It was awesome talking to you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. We'll catch you guys next time on another episode of The Code. Thanks.